It's a DC Digital Media across all of it, I do believe. So it should be live. Let me get my music ready. Let's see. That's not the. It should be this one. Tell me if you can hear this. All right, cool. Cool. Oh, I need to mute that. I don't want any more
Sounds
of
like
that.
Fred Flintstone is on his way.
You know what? I never put that sound. It's the same thing. It's labeled Bewitched. It makes me think of that, but it is the same thing when he do his toes to go bowling, isn't it?
Mm-hmm.
Oh my goodness. Where's my mute button?
Oh, I should do
There
the
it
same,
is.
shouldn't
Found
I?
it.
Proper etiquette.
Psh. When you forge these muscles on hand coding RSS feed, etiquette be damned, Clinton.
Which I did for years and years and years, long past the point where I should have stopped. I was doing it.
Oh man. So you said 6'5". No, I thought the first time I went to, and of course it's a long time ago, right? That we're talking about these things. I know the first podcast awards you were a sponsor of it. Maybe I'm conflating that because for some reason in my mind I thought on Podcast Pickle, which is where I went to find my very first podcast to listen to. I thought you were an advertiser there, but I started in like August of 04.
I was an advertiser on the podcast awards for several years, but Todd didn't start the ones with that website that I think he's still using for the first couple of years of doing it.
It was a different place, right?
Yeah. I mean, it was more, and of course it was, giving the awards out at the expo and so forth. So it was a different setup at that point. Yeah. Then he went to the more formalized structure of the whole ballot thing on the website and the procedures and so forth for it.
Interesting. All right, let's all right, it's that time. We'll hit the music and we're gonna get to going. I don't, yeah, we're not gonna do anything fancy. We're gonna do it as old school as streaming can be because streaming is still new school.
That's right.
This is Behind the Track. And tonight I am happy to have on Clinton Alvert of Comedy4Cast. And it's more of a woof, woof sound. I always stumble over that. So
yes, it's kind of like all board, but all board.
Yeah.
So speaking of tracks, I'd much better be behind the track than on the track, I suppose. So
hey, though, you've been on the digital media track long before I came around. I do believe.
Indeed.
Yeah, so happy to talk with you. We're gonna go down for Clinton and I, a little history lesson for everybody, but it's memory lane for us for the most part. We were just talking as we're getting ready to go live here that it was, I want to say it was in August of 2004 I discovered podcasting, and I could have sworn I already saw his podcast out there, but his tag says June of 05. But it still puts you in the the beginning, right? The before times.
Yeah, I like to say, I got in there before iTunes started.
Yeah. Because I'm sure you're very familiar with it, but Leland, Gary Leland, and the podcast Pickle. That's where you found it, right? As I found the podcast Pickle and was trying to dig through the different genres of humor and music and this and that. Dave Jackson's cooler. What was that? Water cooler, musician's water cooler.
Yeah.
Right.
Boy, yeah.
One of his early shows was on there, and eventually all of us had shows on there. But Clinton, what got you started? Because we're going to use all this. We're just going to kind of do it chronologically, getting you up to Dragon Con and all that story, because this goes way before. I just picture you as Bane. You guys merely adopted streaming. I was born in the RSS feed.
That's
Uh,
right. I tell you, we used to
uh,
walk up RSS feeds both ways.
barefoot in the code. Uh, so, Clinton, what got you into doing podcasting?
Well, I did radio theater in college. I wrote and produced a bunch of stuff for our college radio station. And then for a short time while I was in advertising, for most of my working career. I did some radio spots for that as well. And as a hobby, um, in the Star Trek club I belonged to, I would write plays for that as well.
So you're saying you had to overcome your history of being a jock to really adapt to
Yeah,
this
yeah. I was going to
environment.
say it was a leap to do that. Uh, so when I heard about this, well, the weird thing is that the only reason I heard about podcasting to begin with is because I'm a Disneyland fan, and this
Okay.
was coming up on the 50th anniversary of Disneyland. And Michael Gohagan was doing a podcast that was like all these behind the scenes things going on, getting ready for the July um, celebration. But it was a podcast and only a podcast. And that meant it wasn't streaming. You couldn't go to Disney's site and click and listen to it. You had to download it. Now, I've never had an iPhone and I've owned one iPod. So I had to figure out how to do it without that stuff. And once I downloaded it, I went, well, how does this work? And I looked at the code and I went, well, that's not that hard. And I could do this. And then I was off and running going because it was a great way to do that stuff that I used to do essentially do the college radio plays and do, scripted comedy stuff. And just anybody that wants to listen to it can listen to it.
And when you started, was it the actual kitchen table? Because that's where a lot of people say they started. But where was your actual first recording setup?
The same one I'm in right now. It's
That's a very fancy studio you're in right now.
Thank you. I built it up over the years. No, it's in the spare bedroom, so it's not at the kitchen table because kitchen table is for other things. But no, it's just sitting right here. And of course, I didn't have the equipment that I have now. That kind of built up over the years. But I did start with I had microphones around the house from various other things I've been working on. So the cost of the equipment wasn't that really very much. It was gathering up the resources that I needed to produce the kind of show I was trying to do, which was, work out how to use, which I still do. I use a video editing program to do an audio podcast because I do tons of editing for it. And working out music, where could I get that? And all those type of things. But yeah, it was all basically done here in the studio.
Man, it's so many places to go. First microphone setup.
I think I've still got it over there in the corner. Yeah, I can't remember this. It was like an off-brand, very fancy looking microphone, mind you, but it was very off-brand. However, what I would also use, I knew I'd be helpful to bring in props. What I would use to record sometimes is my iRiver.
Oh, I had an iRiver. I loved it so much.
So the iRiver, for those who don't remember, really was the recorder of choice for podcasters in the very, very early days. Adam Curry used one, and it would record in stereo, and he would take it out for sound seeing tours.
Right. Walk through Austin in different places.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And just get the ambience. And that would be a podcast, kids, just playing sounds of walking someplace.
And it also played MP3s, and you could put your podcast on there to listen to them.
Yeah, but the interface was pretty nasty.
Okay.
It's really
That's
hard
every interface in the early mid to 2000s.
Yeah. The other recorder that I did use, another prop.
Clinton came prepared tonight.
Is my Edirol. And this is the notorious one. I'm trying to get it right. This is notorious one that for every podcaster out there who hated this device, because what would happen is you'd go to record and you'd press the button that says record, and it would light up. And you figure, oh, I'm recording. It was armed. It wasn't recording. You had to press it again to record. And the number of people, including myself, who didn't get some audio because, darn it, you go to stop it and it starts recording.
That's a deep studio thing where people were from radio and whatnot would bring that over, because you have to arm a track. You have to arm something to record it, saying, listen to this. Then you also hit record to then get it. It took us home crafters, if you will, forever to get that down as a habit. But we're talking about pre-USB audio, really. So how did you get your sound into your computer?
I had an old board interface. It was a Behringer, I think, was the Behringer interface to get it into the computer.
I was a homegrown musician, so I had a soundboard and it had some Shure cheap mics, the F50s or whatever, 57s. I don't remember the singing mics, right? That I think I spent mid 2000s, $40 for, even at the time. So I was able to figure that out. And then I already had tried to do some home recording, so I had an adapter and that kind of thing. Skype. Remember Skype came around? You could finally have internet buddies record with you.
Fortunately, I didn't have to try to deal with that for the type of show that I do.
That's because you do the drama and not the drama, the comedy audio.
Right.
Yeah.
But I had been on some calls with people and they were not doing the double ender. So
what's a double ender?
Oh, double ender is so you're recording your audio and I'm recording my audio. And since you're editing it, I get to just send you my file with my audio and you get to put it all together and find out that they're out of sync with each other.
Because computers record at different speeds.
And you have to make that work, because that was the only way really to get good sound. I think there's a new, everything old is new again. I believe that somebody's hyping now this advantage that you can get both sides of the conversation. And I remember even at the early podcast expos, they were trying to solve that problem. There were companies out there saying, oh, well, we've got this, it kind of buffers this and does that and so forth. So it sounds like it's still a problem that needs to be solved.
The best I think Zoom has done, and I don't work for them, I used it in the past, is I think, because I really didn't dig in how they did it, but when they brought the feature around, I think maybe even StreamYard does it now, to where it says it can record both sides of it. And what I'm really thinking it's doing is recording, like it's feeding them both to one server and recording it. So it's almost like patching it in virtually to a board, is my guess. I typically still, the speeds and everything nowadays, it's easier for me to just record everything on my side, even though I can do multi-tracking with it. I did multi-tracking with Skype. I have a picture somewhere, like a printed photograph, right, Clinton, somewhere, of my living room setup where I'm in my recliner and I have a boom mic, boom stand and a microphone. And I had, I think, 2 computers, a Windows computer going to a Mac through a soundboard, because I was trying to route Skype and it was the stuff we went through. And yet, what made you so determined to keep going? You're still podcasting today.
I am. Last episode I put out was 788, and I'm working on 789 and stuff for next year. So what? I don't know what I do, and I'll hit 1,000. I have no idea. I have no digits for that. I don't know. What am I going to do?
Well, okay. How many episodes a year are you putting out?
It's slowed down an awful lot because I found that I spend a lot more time on the audio than I used to. I always spend time on the audio, but I now write the music for the show as well. And I'm not a musician, so that slows things down a lot. And last year I did a musical, so that's that was
what you might call yourself a musician.
Yeah, that's where threw myself into the deep end to learn stuff. So probably over the course of a year these days, I'm putting out about, 30 or 40 episodes. Back when I started, I was putting out 2 episodes a week.
2 episodes a week is a
2
lot for
episodes a week.
edited
Yep. All
series.
scripted, edited, everything done to it.
And now was it a couple of months or where are you at?
It depends. It depends. When I'm doing I have a big story, which used to be my April podcast a day, which was a really misjudgment on my part about what to do there. Because the first year I did it, I thought, oh, this will be good. I'll get a lot of
You're
episodes
so
out.
crazy.
And the thing is that I made that decision to do it in like March. I'm going to do one every single day in April. And I did it. But the next year I kind of planned it out a bit better. And I did podcast a day every single day in April, I think for the first 4 or 5 years that I was doing this. And when I hit the musical, which was last year, it went from starting in May and finished in November. So I said, all right, well, let's change this whole setup now. It's going to be like a big story, and then I have smaller standalone episodes. And so that's the format I'm going with now, which will, like I said, will put me in the area of 30 to 40 over the course of the year.
Okay. I remember, I mean, okay. So we're heading into 2024, right? And right now, as we record this, I've been podcasting roughly 20 years, so timelines kind of get fuzzy for me. I do remember, not fully chronological work, so I want to get back to some Discovery stuff, but it was probably at one of the podcast awards or somewhere you were talking about that. I think at that point it became the dog days of podcasting or something like that, right?
Yes.
Okay. And yeah, you were talking about doing an episode a day. And I mean, I was young and hungry. Well, I guess younger than I am now. So, we're both looking pretty tonight. But I was hungry. It's like, and even though I was like, I'll do a lot for podcasting. And I really want to get famous at doing this. And you said dog days of podcasting. One day I went, yeah, you're crazy. An episode a day, man. That's a lot. And I think even you said, even if it's just like a random recording for 5 minutes or 1 minute, I was like, that makes more sense, but still, that's a lot of work. And yet, you did it multiple years. You did
Yep.
it.
It's still going on. Craig Stepp, with the Technorama podcast, and the other one that I do, The Topic is Trek, he came up with that idea because, people kind of started to get lax in the summertime. And he said, this is a great way to energize everybody to do this. And it varies from year to year, how many people are doing it and who's doing it. Even our good old rock and roll geek, does,
Mike.
And
what's his
so
name? Michael, am I thinking the wrong one?
No.
Yeah.
And it's not a name day for me as well, but yes, you are thinking of them. So, and it will come to me probably in the middle of this whole conversation. I'll just blurt it out.
Blurt it out.
But and some people like I do something that's scripted, but other people pick a theme. They're going to tell a story about their life every day, or some fun fact that they'll read off, or another person does kind of an interactive thing where they do something one day, get some feedback or answers to questions, and kind of take that and go into the next day with that. So there's all different ways to do it.
There, you're right, and creativity is what it is. Now, let's go back a few. Actually, I like the quote better. I'm going to rephrase that. We say it is what it is, but really it is what you make it, right? We made my first pop filter was little pantyhose over a crochet ring, and those kind of things. It is definitely what you make it. And in the early days of podcasting, I felt like I knew everybody.
Yes.
Right. It was a smaller, because of course by nature it's a smaller group. I came across Comedy4Cast, I guess on the first or one of the early podcast awards where you were one of the main sponsors, and you stayed a sponsor there for a very long time. I'm
Mhm.
not sure if you do it now, but it's what okay, so sponsorship, right? And we'll talk about the
Yeah.
awards and
Mhm.
your interaction with them. But you're talking about in the days where at best, you could say, hey, for a cup of coffee, you can donate. And really, it was kind of a PayPal donation. I think there was some other earlier, like tipjar.coms or something you could do. So you're not really making money in a traditional sense, I imagine. And you're
Oh,
not
or any
really,
other any other
okay.
sense
Yeah,
you
like
can
you don't have,
imagine.
I mean, there's some donations here and there, whatever. Maybe every
Right.
once in a while you might get a sponsorship, maybe. When Blueberry came around, they started linking people together to do ads and whatnot. But what made you put money into it, into the awards, into anything else that you've been a sponsor of
Well
or got your name out there with?
well, 2 things. I mean, with when I was doing the People's Todd calls it the People's Choice Podcast Awards, I saw it twofold. One is that I thought it was good exposure for me because I had placement top of page above the fold right next
Yeah.
to the logo. And the second thing was that I really always want to encourage podcasts. And so if this is a way to do it, then I thought that was great. When the first uh, podcast movement came along, it was sponsored by a bunch of corporations and Comedy4Cast.
Yeah.
So, because again, I love the idea so much of what this is, not necessarily what it is sometimes, but what it is in general, that I like to encourage people. I like to encourage people by, retweeting if they put out a show or, whatever it is, just get the word out there, especially about the type of shows that I do, which is a rare bird. And I
Yeah.
don't say that to be like, oh, I'm so hoity toity. I mean, it's so rare that you want to make sure other people get exposure if you can offer it to them.
Well, describe your podcast to everybody.
So my podcast is short. It started off at 4 minutes, which is why it was Comedy4Cast. But since then, it's grown to the point where it's about 10 minutes long or so. And it's a lot of the episodes these days are centered around a fictitious town called Middling Fair in undisclosed state, in undisclosed, it's sitting there in a place called Chasm Valley. And we interact with the characters, sometimes as part of a story, sometimes just a one-off. For instance, the next episode I'm writing is a Detective Hart story, and he's Middling Fair's best and only detective. And he's based on a Humphrey Bogart type character, and this is a help. Can you outwit Detective Hart and solve this crime before he does type of thing? And then other ones are Danny Hillcrest, who does movie reviews and never watches the movies. He just watches YouTube for the trailers, and he gives a review based on that alone.
I love it.
And then sometimes it's a bigger story that involves all these characters. Sometimes I'll do other things, like when I do Dog Days, it's just me doing something. I might have the characters in there kind of butting in or something, but I'll often do those by myself. So if you're listening and one thing is going on, it may suddenly switch to something else for a month or so, and I just which to me is that's because that's what's interesting to me. It's like I don't want it to be the same thing all the time. I'd
Yeah.
like it to be something different, and I'm hoping that people are along for that ride, to get some different stuff happening.
You're talking about 20 years of doing this. What was one of your best moments? I mean, it can be for your show, it can be just you personally, something you saw happen because of podcasting. What's one of the greatest moments you've seen in the history of podcasting?
Well, I think one of my favorite excuse me, should have muted the microphone. Sorry. Not used to being live like that.
We'll cut it in post. Don't worry about it.
Um, one of them, quite honestly, was going to that first podcast expo as far as my stuff in podcasting, because you were talking about the fact that everybody knows each other. Well, the first podcast expo was at the end of 2005, and podcasting was still small enough that practically everybody did know each other or had heard of each other or had interacted with them on Podcast Pickle or Podcast Alley.
That came around. Yep.
Mm-hmm. So to have everybody together in one spot, and the weird thing was that you didn't recognize their face because it's podcasting. It's just audio. I mean, some people do use their face for the cover art, and so those people you could pick up right away. Other people, you had to like listen, and you heard all these voices around because we all went to the bar, and some people were playing pool, like Don and Drew were playing pool with some other people and so forth. And you would hear the podcasts live walking around you. It was the most surreal thing ever. I've also made a lot of good friends out of podcasting. The first podcast expo that I went to the live show that the Radio Adventures of Dr. Floyd was doing. And they brought the puppets with them.
Okay.
To do the show, the Dr. Floyd puppet. And I got my picture taken with the Dr. Floyd puppet. I was so excited. Well, the next year came along and I went to the show because they put on a second show, and I went to that and I talked to Grant a bit. And then the third year, I sponsored the Radio Adventures of Dr. Floyd's show at the Podcast Expo. So that, I mean, and I'm still friends with Grant to this day. And my friend Paul Barry, who does a show, we were talking about those sound seeing tours that Adam would do. Well, my friend Paul Barry does A Window to the Magic, which is binaural audio. Okay. Starting in 2005, binaural audio. Okay. And he'll walk around the Disney parks and so it's like if you put on your headphones and you close your eyes, you can imagine that you're there. And so I met up with him at the second podcast expo, and we've been friends ever since. So I think it's a lot of things, and like my friends Chuck and Craig, who I met through this. It's corny, but it's those first impressions and those first people that I met, and kind of that same vibe with the first podcast expo. It's fun to be nominated for awards. It's even more fun to win them.
How many have you won?
I've won a grand total of 3. I've got one of them here because these awards no longer exist. These were the podcast peer awards. So I won 3 podcast peer awards back in the day. And I've been nominated. I was nominated a couple of times in the People's Choice Awards as well, which took me by surprise because I don't have the audience to mount the type of campaign that you need to drive those numbers. So it's like, it's an honor to be nominated because that's all that's going to happen.
Yeah, I've said many times with Susan Lucci of Podcast Awards, I've been nominated 11 or 12 times, never gotten close to getting one. So it's rare
also the Parsec Awards, which used to be presented at
Dragon Con. Yep. It is rare that I get to ask somebody this, and before we transition to some other things that we want to talk about, how did I first come across your radar? When did I first come across your radar?
The first time I remember seeing you, see if I'd made it to the roast, but the first time
that'd have been good.
I remember meeting you was after
was it in Vegas?
No, this was at Dragon Con, I believe.
Okay. I couldn't remember if we crossed paths before Dragon Con.
Because you came up to me after I had done my live show. That was at the point where I was doing a live show and Technorama was doing their own. And then later on we merged them. and you wanted to tell me about podcast movement. And I had done the first podcast movement. I had been a sponsor of the first podcast movement, and I did not like podcast movement because I went there. And so I think I tried not to be rude to you, but I felt like, "No, I don't know. I don't." And you were trying to
I
convince
do
me.
remember that because yeah, you and your wife at the table, and yeah, I was yeah,
So I think that's the first time that I met you. And like I said, I hope I didn't come across as rude. It just, for me, it wasn't what I was looking for. Gary Leland had said that, the podcast Pickle had said that one of the main ideas of this was to get that old school, podcast expo
right.
vibe. And it really wasn't. It was really
It
a
really wasn't.
marketing vibe.
Yeah,
And
you're
I
right.
just, you
Yeah.
know,
And no, you didn't come across rude at all. That was the very first year I was at Dragon Con. And yeah,
yeah.
I remember that was up in 212 when you had finished your show and that. So you brought some slides. But before we get to slides, I do want to ask, so the balance of what's one of the greatest moments, if there is one, what's one of the worst moments in podcasting that you've experienced?
Ooh. To be quite honest, it was when my site got hacked. And
Mm,
I'm not a techie. I don't know how to fix that. I was going to pack up shop and say, well, I'll do something else. I don't know. I'll have to start again with some of
yeah.
it because I had no idea how to fix it. And Craig Stepp, who I keep mentioning because he's ace. He said, well, let me have a look. And he got the site cleaned up and me back up and running. So, but that feeling when you go
Yeah.
to your site and it's like, what's going on here? Yeah, that was the pits.
Yeah. Yeah, and we get by with help from our friends. I knew enough to get in trouble. We both talked about hand coding RSS feeds. Now I use Spotify, right? Because I was on Anchor and now Spotify owns it. So it's like now I load it and I know what's going on in the background, but you don't have to do it anymore. You just upload it, hit the go button, and everything's done. We used to go in by hand, and if you messed up an enclosure or something, it'd mess up the whole feed. I had to recode something like 60 or 70 episodes to start a whole new iTunes feed because I'd
Hmm.
messed up my first RSS feed.
Well, one of the problems, because we were talking before we started. I hand coded my RSS feed longer than I really probably should have because it was getting up into like many episodes. And one of the problems was that when iTunes came along, they started saying, "Oh, we want this tag and we want it to be structured this way for our." And so you had to suddenly start incorporating all these new things, and you had to keep up with it because
Yeah.
they were like still in the early stages, and they were deciding, well, now it's going to be this or it's going to be that, or you got. And it, that's when it finally reached the point where I said, I just can't do this anymore, and I went to Blueberry. Um, to and but the great thing is I'm sure you'd agree, is that if something is wrong, you have a possibility
Yeah.
of spotting it if you open up that RSS feed.
Yes.
You know,
Yeah. 'Cause you knew
you
what
have
it
a
looked like.
clue.
You knew what it's supposed to look like. Yeah. And it's not like we were able to just jump on YouTube and Google something like, how do I fix this? That didn't exist. We were making it up as we went.
You
And
opened up somebody else's and
yeah.
dissected what they did.
Yes, yes, absolutely. I borrowed a book from the library, how to code RSS feeds, so I could go and figure out what I did wrong and just like you said, parse it out, figure it out. And that's probably a good transition here to your slides. Uh, so let's talk about this one.
So I wanted to, because we talked about a couple of these things, and I wanted to, we're taking the trip down memory lane. On the right hand side, I have trouble remembering left and right. So on the right hand side, we were talking about Podcast Alley and Podcast Pickle. Now, Podcast Alley was the competitor to Podcast Pickle. They were both
Yes.
podcast directories. So you didn't have a lot of places you could go to get a list of podcasts. in the early days,
Right.
especially before even Apple entered the game. It was like, where do you go? So there were a couple of places, the ones that had interfaces rather than just being a menu of things were these two. Podcast Alley um, had a very active forum, a very vocal forum, a very raw forum. Um, and
Yeah.
they had their top podcasts and all those type of features. Uh, Podcast Pickle, run by Gary Leland, was I believe Podcast Pickle was first. I could be wrong
I
about
think
that.
it was because when I went searching for podcasts, that was the first thing. I think Podcast Alley came actually a few months later.
So they were the same type of thing. They had the forums, but as you can see, they would highlight a lot of different shows on the homepage,
Mm-hmm.
and you'd be able to maneuver through the category. So it was kind of whichever one you wanted to use was fine, but there were devotees and defenders of both of
Yeah.
them. And it sometimes it was tongue in cheek, and sometimes so one of the best parts about podcast Expo, the first one is that, and I cannot remember the person's name who ran Podcast Alley, might come to me again later, um, is that they met up and shook hands and they were fine and, no big deal. So that was nice. Now, up on the left-hand side, I don't know if you remember this one, Charles, KYOU.
That one I don't
KYOU,
know.
well,
Yeah.
KYOU was a radio station, a broadcast radio station that their programming was podcasts.
Okay.
And you could submit your show to them and they might schedule it
Oh.
for over the air.
Yeah. So I did a lot of R-rated stuff in the very beginning. So
Yeah,
yeah.
so they probably would not have put that on. One of the biggest things that they put on, no surprise, was Coverville,
Of course.
because not only was that all music, but Brian Ibbett went through all the hoops it took to get approval and pay the
Yeah.
royalties to play the music. I never asked Brian if he had to change what he had to pay while it wasn't KYOU, because now it's a different
Broadcast
medium,
versus download. Yeah.
right?
All right.
But they're no longer around. And then another thing I just threw in here at the last minute because I was thinking about it. Back when podcasting started, if you had your website, you would have a link to your Frapper map.
Yes. I loved my Frapper map. It was so cool.
So your Frapper map was not something generated automatically. People would go to this site, you give them a link to, this is the Frapper map page for Comedy4Cast or whatever it is, and you would indicate where you were listening from.
And you had to put the pin in yourself, and
Yep.
you put a little comment with it. Yeah.
Right. So that was that was a measure of where somebody was listening from, is our Frapper map.
Yeah.
They didn't last very long. I don't know whether my belief is that part of it is that they weren't charging for the service, and podcasters probably just sent them over the edge with their fees.
The bandwidth and whatnot. Yeah. I loved it because you can't do it here. I haven't tried to, but you could click on the little pin and see, where they were, where they pinned it, and like their first name and last initial and the comment they left it. And I just was fascinated. I just would check it every week just to see if I got somewhere new, and it blew my mind because you can see, I'm sure this is yours that you have the picture of here.
Oh no, this is somebody else. I did not have the foresight to grab a screenshot of mine before it went down. So
who knew stuff would go down back then, right?
I know. It's like, I thought this stuff was going to last forever.
Forever. You don't back up anything. It's there on my website. And then, yeah. So yeah. Okay. But still, you see the majority was there in the US, but then you get that one down in South America, one down in South Africa, Asia. It was so fascinating. I loved when and then I'd call them out. Did you do that? I'd always say, oh, your Mark S in South Africa is now listening to my show. How cool is that, man? Thank you so much.
And the thing is, I don't know if you consider it more real, because I wonder sometimes we get, you can get stats now about who's listening from where,
right,
all the time. But since everybody can VPN, are they really in Sweden or are they in New Jersey?
Right. Tyra is running the chat right now. She said they did that in Leveling Azeroth. They had the Frapper map and called it out. And that's the thing, right? It was not about marketing, which a lot of the data is now about marketing. It was literally a connection to another human being, seeing that pinpoint drop in there. It was so amazing. And I know what this is, but what is this, Clinton?
Well, I said I never owned
An
an
iPod.
iPhone, and I had one iPod,
That's
which
right.
I got
Yeah.
long after podcasting started, when I was trying to see, well, can I check my feed on this thing, type of thing. This was a SanDisk. I'm trying to remember the exact name of this version, but this is an MP3 player. There were different brands of this, and you would hook them up to your computer. So if you went to iPod or X
Yep.
and got your podcasts in there, you could just hook it up through the USB, and it would download them. Of course, it varied on what they would show on the screen. You can see this is very simple. I assume very much like an iPod would have been back then. You've got just a rocker, button type of thing, a little dial wheel to get it the shows. But it was what I used. It got me by until the stuff was really easier to get and listen to directly on the desktop.
And that was a thing. You really had trouble listening on the desktop.
Oh yes.
And on a website. I mean, when we first were able to code a player on the website, it changed the game. But even then, we were not sitting on our computers trying to listen or watch things. We were working or playing video games and moving on and not living on the internet. So even if you hit play, now you had a 4-minute show. I'm sure people listened to that a lot more than my 2.5-hour show.
Not the longest show back in those days, though. I will say.
No.
Yaz, I think, put out some 6-hour shows or something back in the day.
Man, they did say, there's another one that got in trouble, but they did episodes where they just sit and read the newspaper, and it was crazy. But yeah, you would have to put it on these machines. I had a Creative Rio. I'm trying to remember, I had a couple of them like this, and then my favorite, still to this day, my favorite was the Microsoft Zune. I loved it.
As seen in Guardians of the Galaxy, kids.
Yes, it was the newest one. Yeah. All right, and then you've got one more slide here.
So this is
all right.
This is stuff from the podcast. The first, I think the banner is from the second podcast expo. Just the sea of people. Yeah, we were all white guys, back in the early days, or mostly, not all. I shouldn't say all, but yeah, we were just having a go at this thing. But in this photo, you mentioned Dave Jackson before. He's right there in the photo on the left, right above that second photo. You can use a blue shirt. He's right there. Brian Ibbett is in the background. CC Chapman is behind Brian Ibbett.
I see him, red shirt. Yep.
I can't remember the name of the guy that did IT Conversations. He's talking to Brian Ibbett. So this, like, everybody was there. The photo that's below is in the center, in the white shirt, is Gary Leland in the podcast Pickle shirt. That's Dan Class. And I'm struggling to remember the name. Somebody out there would remember much better than I, because I never had a chance to listen to the show. The father and son that were there. That's not El Nacho. El Nacho was a different person.
Okay.
Dances with Elephants, I think, was the podcast that they did. Me with Dr. Floyd, the puppet Dr. Floyd, the first podcast expo. And from the second one, I thought I would just, have the sponsors of that, because I didn't get a chance to see how many of them are still around. I don't know. Podango, Podcast Ready,
Video Maker
might be. I don't know, but
WordCast, yeah.
There was a lot of booths and a lot of other things that those, they just didn't serve. The magazines that were just podcasting specific. And now there's another one that's come out. I can't remember its name, because I got an email and then that was it about it. And they were actually going to do a physical magazine as well as online. I'm thinking, why
Exactly.
would you do that?
Right. Now tell me about the Give Love a Chance reception there.
So that I put that in there to remind me of Brother Love, who was
Oh man, yes.
yep, he was he and Cashbox Cashbox is it was it Cash did on a podcast. It's not the right name, Cashbox, but something
Nah.
like that. Um, they were very early. Michael was it Michael Ebel, Matthew Ebel, and one other who the guy that did the one about Are We Your Brains and so forth. He's still out there doing it. So there were a few artists who Colton. There were a few artists out there
Yes.
that really got into podcasting early,
Jonathan
seeing it as a,
Colton.
yeah, who got the idea that this would be a good way to market themselves. Jonathan Colton, one of the things he did was, I think he did it for a year, was a podcast called Thing a Week, and he would do a new song every single week. And the great thing about these artists was their whole shtick was to be on podcasts. You want to play them? You can play
Yes.
them.
Yes.
And nobody was like, "Hey, yeah, what's the big deal? What's going on here?" Now you can get that, but usually it's somebody that you know personally that you'd be able to get that kind of permission
Yeah.
from.
And I mean, Jonathan Colton now is on I think it's Wait,
Something on
Don't Tell
NPR.
Me on NPR. Yeah,
It's not wait, don't tell me. It's something. It was like tell
Ask
me
Me
another or
Another.
something like that. Yeah, ask me another.
Yeah,
Right.
yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, and it just is crazy how things have moved through. Grammar Girl, Mignon Fogarty,
Who's
right?
still out there doing it?
Yeah, doing amazing things. I got to meet her early on at a conference and work with her and become friends, and then to see her become a Jeopardy question was like amazing. My brother-in-law had tagged me, he was like, "Hey, on Jeopardy they have this podcast question." He was in podcasting. I was like, "Oh yeah," and he had recorded it for me. It's like cool. And I was like, "He's on TiVo or whatever, right, dude?" And we had the hardest time figuring out how to get it off the TiVo so I could send it to her so she could see that she had become a Jeopardy question in her own right, which is really great. So let's transition this to where we are now. What state do you live in?
Massachusetts.
Okay, so it is a bit of a travel to get to Dragon Con every year in Atlanta, Georgia. What got you going to Dragon Con? Because it's not, I mean, you helped build probably the podcast track, but it at its start, it was not what even Podcast Expo was for what we do. What got you wanting to go to Atlanta to the basement of a hotel?
Well, I had gone to I've gone to Dragon Con with my wife, my son, and a bunch of our friends from the Star Trek group back in 2005. The next year, the podcast track started. Yeah, the year after I'm there, they decided they're going to start the podcast.
You were the catalyst, Clinton.
Track.
I
Must have been.
Energy just fed it.
So I said, well, I've been thinking about going back, and this seems like a good opportunity to do so. It gives me something to do while I'm there. So I submitted to be on the track, and Swoopy said, sure, that would sound great. So we were upstairs next to the Skeptics track at that time, and I had a blast doing it. The Technorama would do the show right after mine. So they watched my show. I sat down, I watched their show. We kind of went back and forth as we're doing our shows. So for me, it was a way to, because I've been going to conventions. My first convention was a New York Star Trek convention back in 1977, I believe, back when the early New York con started the whole Star Trek con thing. So we've run some, and I've gone to a bunch around here. I actually was at the proto Dragon Con as well, because we were doing a convention for the 20th anniversary of Star Trek in 1986. So we went to Worldcon in Atlanta in 1986, which really is
Okay.
the origin story of Dragon Con. Because that's where they were like, formulating all their plans to be doing this thing. So I had, interest in going back, and this was certainly something that was going to be something that, made it, fun,
More worth
because
your
I'd
while.
also
Yeah.
never done a live show for a Comedy Forecast. That was the first live show I'd ever done, and that was, years after I'd started the show.
And that what's funny about you're talking about doing a 4-minute show. Now it's 10 minutes.
No,
You've got to
yeah,
fill at that
an
time, you had
hour.
to fill 50 minutes to
Yep.
start with.
Mm-hmm.
And you had to do that live. You never done it live. How did you jump that gap?
That's a great question. I know I kind of blank on that. I think out of self-preservation. No, I
Panic podcast.
yeah, I just had to write an awful lot of stuff. I took months to write a bunch of things. I also tapped other people to help me out. Grant Pachoco was there one year, and he agreed to be a guest of mine so we could do some bits. Another person, John Bell from Bells in the Bat Free, he came and did some bits from my show as well to, just kind of help round it out. The one time things, talk about worst moments. Okay, all right. You reminded me of a worst moment. Not as bad as losing my entire site, but I had Brian Ibbett on my panel as a guest one year. And the idea was I was going to be asking him these random questions about music that were just really off the wall, just made no sense. They were just bizarre. So I said, Brian, I'm not going to give you the questions ahead of time because I want your reaction when you hear the question.
Mm-hmm.
He says, okay, that sounds good. That sounds like fun. Came up. I had left the questions in my hotel room.
Oh no. Oh no. What'd you do?
I panicked. I just didn't. I kind of confessed that's what was going on. And I just kind of tried to move on as best as I could at that point. I remember looking down from the stage because Grant was there that year. And I looked and said, is this what it feels like to die on stage? And he went, what are you asking me? I've never died on stage. So Brian said, and what would happen is just like I try to remember people's names, and I said they're going to come up to me randomly. Every once in a while, I would think of one of the questions. I would stop what I was doing in whatever bit I was in it, and I would ask Brian the question in the audience, and he would answer. So
Nice.
he said, well, I'd like to do the show again, but let's just do it with a script. And I said, that sounds good to me. So we did it again with, the next year with a script.
That's so. I mean, it was horrible, but it turned into such a good memory too of what you were able to pull off there. I know when I came up to become director, the first year I was officially director, I announced at the end of the year that we're going to change the name to Digital Media because I just felt like I just inherently felt like we were missing something. We were trying to. I wanted to include people. I wanted to bring more people in, and I felt like as calling it podcast, and it was a little not controversial. I mean, dude, every time we think something's new, it's not new, right? It just keeps coming. Podcasting has died how many times in the last 20 years? But it just felt like there was a struggle between what are we versus what is YouTube, and it's like, no, we are creators. And I actually I wanted to call it Digital Media Creators Track, and Dragon Con's like, kill the creator part because they didn't understand that. They understood fandom. Right. I think if I were to pitch it today, we would do that. But they understood fandom, and they said, well, it feels like if you call it creator, you're missing the mark of including people. So let's just call it digital media.
Okay. Well, I can see that.
Yeah, I did the same thing. And you and Clinton and Chuck. No, you're Clinton. You and Craig and Chuck. Craig and Chuck.
I mean, what my identity? I'm looking down at my name on the screen there.
You guys reached out and said, hey, we'd like to talk to you about what's going on with the track and where you're going with it. And that might have been actually the first real time I got to really sit and kind of in a creators brainstorming session with you guys. And you just share some open ideas, and it very much went from you guys being worried about, well, is everything that you wanted that whole podcast expo feel. Like we're trying to
Right.
come together and just be together. And it sounded like I was taking it in the route of everywhere else. And I don't remember the exact details of the conversation, but I do remember in the process of talking it out with the three of you, we're like, yeah, we're trying, we got a better vision together of how we can bring more of that inclusion to the table. Cause man, I tell you, been a New Media Expo and there's parts of it I liked. There's a lot of parts I didn't like. Podcast movement, same thing. But I always felt, I could come or go. I didn't feel included. I want
No.
everybody to always feel included on this track. And from that moment, I mean, it's been years now that you've kept coming back, kept bringing back it's now called Technorama and Friends.
Comedy4Cast, Technorama, and Friends.
Gotcha. And you're doing the Trek show now on the Trek track.
And in the
where,
parade.
Oh, I didn't even realize you were in the parade. Very
Yeah,
cool.
the bunch of us we're the last group in the parade. We're the Futurama group. We're actually behind the 501st because we have Santa. Santa, it's Robot Santa, evil Robot Santa, but it's Santa. So Santa always ends the parade. So there you go.
There you go. From what you're talking about, you coming in and doing your show separate. Now you've merged it to this past year. What's been your ride? What have you loved about your path through Dragon Con?
To me, it's getting over the nervousness of doing something that I do here in the luxurious Comedy4Cast studio all by myself, just recording a single voice, starting over again, recording the other voice and editing that stuff together, but instead presenting. And the first time I did that was nerve-wracking because I mean, I'd been on stage before and even sometimes my own material, but this was just like, but there's no place to hide. There's literally no place to hide. You know, it's just you. And now I feel much more comfortable with that. So to me, even though it's only once a year, which you would think, well, you're going to forget everything in the meet. No, you know, I try to hone in, even Chuck Craig and I usually have what we call it a dead dog party, which was an old con term that they had never heard of before. Where we kind of say, okay, what worked, what didn't work, what do we want to do more of, what do we do less of? So it's become something that is now fine-tuned. And I'm trying to do the same thing we're all trying to do the same thing with the topic is Trek panel. We're doing the Trek track now because we've only been doing that for a couple of years. And that's at the state that our other shows were at the beginning. So it's going through that same process, hopefully faster because we know more of how this all works. So I don't get to meet as many people at the digital track because I find myself not going to anything. I'm like racing around trying to prepare for all this stuff. I've been to a panel in probably like 3 or 4 panels over the course of the last 5 Dragon Cons. So getting a chance to, if I'm not doing that, sometimes I go, I should go down to the digital media track, but I think I'll take a nap instead. That's a good idea right now.
Yeah.
So I think that's a regret that I don't get a chance, to be there more often. I used to always be at the kickoff panel, when you were doing it, when Brian was doing it, when Swoopy was doing it, whoever was doing that, I was always there for that. And I just haven't had a chance to do that the past couple of years. So that's a bad on my part, but it's things get so hectic. But the part that I like is going back and interacting with the audience. Anybody new that's coming in, hopefully it's some of my fellow podcasters and or other, Twitch people or YouTubers, whoever is, come in just to enjoy a show that's a different show than they're used to doing. I just enjoy that. And I think one of the things that's great about that is that too often, oh, my soapbox has arrived. Thank you. Too often when I hear the term podcasting, and that somebody said this on a on a video the other day that, well, that's just a bunch of people sitting around talking. And I
That's
went,
all anything is.
yeah. And I said, oh, is it really now? I'll remember that the next time I'm editing, 17 layers of audio to produce 4 minutes of finished product. And so letting people hear and see
Yeah.
what goes into a show that's audio theater, that's actual bits, and that's what the show is when you're not watching it at Dragon Con. It's also what you're hearing when you listen to the show, that it's a different animal than, because I don't consider, podcasts to be just a bunch of people sitting around talking, but I don't consider it to be the only thing that podcasts are, right?
True.
Podcasts are also music podcasts like
Mhm.
Brian's. They're, shows like mine and Kai and Chris Conroy's Tech Diff and, John Bell's Bells in the Bat Free that are scripted audio, I've joined now part of the Mutual Audio Network, which is all audio theater. They do 5 days a week of audio theater. It's out there. And they even have one at Dragon Con, the Atlanta Radio
Mhm.
Theater comes in and
Mhm.
does a live presentation of a
Yep.
radio play. So that's part of it too, is to let people know that, hey, there's also this kind of podcast.
It is really, really cool. Now, as we wrap up here, just about to wrap up, you mentioned to me that as we were getting the show ready, that Leo Laporte, who does the Twit Network, right? And
Mhm.
he arguably, helped elevate in the public eye what podcasting was and where it could be, and used a lot of that it's not really Hollywood, but he came from G4 and other broadcast mediums and really brought that level of production to what he did. And now 15, 16, 20 years later, he is looking for new avenues, it sounds like.
Yeah,
What do
well,
you
I
think
mean,
of that?
he's still going to be doing the Twit network, but it's going to be much greatly reduced. I was reading the article from, I think I want to give credit where credit is due. It came out of, is it Podcast News, the one that comes out daily? They had a link to the transcript of what he started off last Sunday's Twit with, that he had to lay off 3 of his employees because I believe it's his wife, who's the accountant. They ran the numbers and they were looking at a $1.1 million deficit for the network. So they had to slash shows and they had to slash,
Hmm.
heads. One of the people had been there. Jason Howell had been there for 13 years. He came there when Tom Merritt and everybody came to Twit way back in the day, and he
Mhm.
stayed. Because Leo says that podcasting doesn't seem to be where advertising wants to be anymore. That he believes it's because it's too ambiguous about who's actually listening. That you don't have it down to the second who's listening when. It's not, you have no Nielsen rating for it. Whereas Spotify or YouTube can say exactly how long they stayed watching, what you had on when they rewound something, and all this, so whether they skipped your ad or not, type of thing. And so he was concerned that that was a trend that was going to continue. I put out I'm still going to call it a tweet, because what else am I going to
Sure.
call it? And on Facebook, that it seems like podcasting is going through a rough time right now, but I've always felt like the type of show that I do is made for this medium. And in spite of anything that's going to happen out there, and you can call my show a podcast, you can call it audio theater, you can call it a radio play, you can call it whatever you want to, just come and listen, because I'm going to be around doing it at that point. Because I was talking to my wife about it, saying that we often talk about, a rising tide floats all boats.
Right.
And I said, I never really bought into that. And I have a feeling that this is a great example of it, that, certain, when the names came into this, they rose up. Mark Maron rises up, and Trevor Noah rises up, and Joe Rogan rises up. And yes, some independents like do rise up, but they'll also ruin some of what podcasting is if people go, oh, I tried to do a podcast and it didn't make $1 million, so I didn't bother to do it anymore. So you shouldn't bother me. Just go to YouTube and do something. And I, so I feel like, no, that's not, to me, that's not what podcasting is. Podcasting is, and I said, it's no rules. It's you in front of a microphone doing what you want to do, and anybody can hear it. And never forget that part about it. That's the power that attracted me to podcasting, is that I don't have to get approval for anything that I'm going to do. It goes through no committee. That's what I'm going to do, and that's what I do.
Thank you, Clinton. That's some great advice and some great words for everybody listening and watching and downloading later. That it's no rules. I mean, from day one, no rules. You just do what you're going to do. And to kind of mirror what Todd Cochran says is own your media. You know, put it in a place that you want it, because whether you like it or not, at the end of the day, YouTube runs the roost when you're on YouTube, and Twitch runs the, everywhere that we're streaming live now can shut us down because it's their platform.
Yep.
But the recording and everything that we do and how we put it out on our own sites, that's where it is, and that's where we want it to be. So tell everybody again where they can find you.
You can find my show at the worst possible name a podcast has ever had. It seemed clever at the time. Comedy4Cast. That's all one word with the number 4 in the middle, because remember, it used to be a 4-minute show. Comedy4Cast, the number 4. I've gotten Alexa to recognize it once or twice, but not that often. I also do a podcast with my friends Chuck Tomasi and Craig Stepp called The Topic is Trek. So that's at thetopicistrek.com. And that one we also do as a video through StreamYards, and we put that out as well. We were doing it as an audio long before we decided to, we're doing it anyway. We're sitting around, we're using the medium. Let's just record it as well and put it out.
That's great. You can find what we do here on DC Digital Media on our link tree, linktr.ee/DC Digital Media. And I did find out the other day, it does not mean, it doesn't matter if it's caps or lower, because my link tree is RGOP42 and I write it in caps, but I actually typed it lowercase the other day to work just fine. And that's where you can find everything for me. I need everybody to help me out. Next Tuesday, I'm taking over the open mic night, and I'm testing out my con game show, Fandom Face Off. And you can play live from home. It's like a Jackbox TV type thing where you can get your phone out and go to the link that I'm going to put on the screen, and you can vote. There's going to be some craziness, like who would make for a better president, Batman or Thanos. That kind of thing. And there's no right answers. It's whoever votes and gets the most votes. That's the answer that wins. And as you go through, when we get into the final showdown, where there's 4 answers, there's a scoreboard that goes up. And like Clinton, you get points for every right answer every right answer gets voted for. You get points for that. And then the goal is to win the most points in the game. And it's got some fun little graphics where things explode and that kind of thing. So I'm doing a test run next week before I bring this to cons throughout the next year. So please join me here on DC. Mainly it's going to be on twitch.tv/DC Digital Media, but we'll also be on YouTube and Facebook, and the chat will take your comments and everything else in between there. So Clinton, man, I appreciate you being on. I hope when you get ready to do show 1000 that you do it live at Dragon Con. And we can have a big party and celebrate.
Sounds good to me.
All right, everybody, tune in next week. Come on and join me and come out and play. And go ahead. Tickets are on sale right now for Dragon Con. So if you're not like Clinton and you get a pro, but do you put in for the pro badge? Because I think I know somebody who would give you a pro badge.
I did it once. The year I did it, I got to be pro twice, because 2020 was the year I was.
Yes, it was. Yes.
So they carried it over at least for the next year.
Yeah. But yeah, if you don't get a pro badge, which Clinton could easily get, go ahead and get your tickets on sale now, because right now, quite literally, it's the cheapest you're going to get them all year round. So, Clinton, I hope you have a great holiday, and thanks for being on with us tonight.
Oh, my pleasure, and same to you.